Finding the Past, Local and Global Communities. Workshop 1, Introduction. Welcome to this module. In this module we'll be looking at how communities write their own histories, why community history is really important, and how new resources such as digitised archives and online sharing have transformed the study of local and global history. Important thing to be aware of is the distinction between history of communities and history by communities. So history of communities is often written by either academic historians or by local councils for heritage purposes, such as in museums, or you see on the right hand side Hackney Government, Hackney Council have got their own community history web pages to celebrate the diverse communities in their borough. And then there's history by communities, so specific groups who decide to write their own histories without direction from academics or government agencies. So I've just put on the screen two examples, such as the Waltham Forest Oral History Project, who are local people in that area interviewing and creating oral histories, and then Queer in Brighton, which is an LGBT community project in Brighton. Do follow those links and have a look at their websites. And we'll be discussing, you can see in the Brighton example that they are Heritage Lottery funded, and we'll be discussing the pros and cons of Heritage Lottery funding for such initiatives. So where does it all start? Well, we're going to be looking a bit about the historiography of community history and local history in particular in this module. But there's this term which we'll see keep coming up, which is history from below. History from below developed in the 1960s and particularly in the 1970s, and still continuing. Sometimes you hear it being termed people's history. Up to the 1960s, and I'm generalising here, social history had been very academic, and mainstream history had been all about high politics, economics, and looking at the great and good and important people who changed history. That was challenged in the post-war era, and historians started to move their emphasis away from high politics and look towards the history of everyday life, or ordinary people. So the social history of the people downstairs rather than upstairs in a country house, for example. A lot of these historians emphasising that the history of ordinary people was just as important as the history of elites came from left-wing persuasions, and the most famous of which was probably E.P. Thompson, historian who was employed by Warwick University, but also did a lot of his work with the WEA, the Workers' Education Association, where he taught adult learners in deprived areas of Yorkshire. His classic book is The Making of the English Working Class, published first in 1963. And in The Making of the English Working Class, do recommend you read it, he focused on ordinary people. He said his mission was to rescue ordinary people from the condescension of posterity, i.e. that previous historians didn't think that ordinary people were worth studying. And so his political mission, which came from his communist views, very much fueled his historical research, and that influence has continued, even though left-wing history is a lot less prominent now in historical thinking, but that idea of a social history of ordinary people, people's history from below, has continued. History from below was also fueled by other challenges to mainstream history. And by mainstream history I mean this political and economic history taught in elite universities. So the history workshop movement was another left-wing and also feminist group of academic historians who decided, particularly in the 1970s, to write history collectively and focus on unrepresented people in traditional histories. And we also have all the big sort of campaign groups who then influenced historians, such as feminist histories, black histories, queer histories, all different types of different communities. Sometimes they self-identified as communities, sometimes they didn't, writing histories that of people that they thought had been ignored by traditional historians. But I will put a word of caution here, especially with Workshop Journal, which was quite controversial. Most of these groups were still directed by academic historians, trying to rewrite these people back into history. From the 1980s onwards, particularly from the 1990s, you see a different type of people's history, and that's much more based on community projects. These community projects have always existed in some form or another, but they've increasingly become formalised, and that's partly because of the role of the Heritage Lottery Fund. So the Heritage Lottery Fund from the 1990s is set up to preserve British heritage, and it challenged mainstream funding by traditional bodies like English Heritage, National Trust, who perhaps mistakenly, but to a great extent, were associated with preserving the heritage of castles, stately homes, i.e. the heritage of elite people. And the Heritage Lottery Fund is very much focused on supporting small projects, community heritage. So community heritage projects are often started by pre-existing local groups such as the WEA, Historical Association, particularly residents associations and other community groups. And so I've put St Luke's Community History Group in Finsbury there as an example. Do go and have a look at the website, that sort of thing that they do. So you see that shift from the history of the mansion house, the picture there is from the stately homes in Yorkshire, towards community groups in local halls, learning new skills, learning about their history, and that's the Oral Heritage Project. Oral history is often a big thing for community groups as they try to record the memories of their members. Community history has also achieved a greater prominence because of programmes on TV. Again, traditional history programming have been very much focused on big events and celebrities or important people and war or elites, and now we see a lot more programmes about ordinary people, social history, but I'm picked on particularly the BBC programme Who Do You Think You Are, which builds on a huge rise in interest in family history. The correct term is genealogy, but most people use family history because it's a bit more inclusive. And so Who Do You Think You Are looks at, as you may have seen, the family histories of celebrities, but very much focusing on looking at the archives, looking at the census and parish records. And it's interesting the sorts of questions that they ask, the way that they try and construct a narrative about your identity is defined by your ancestors. And this is not a new thing, but it's been increasingly popular, this trying to build your family tree. And one of the things that's made it popular has been online resources and digitisation, which has transformed access to the sources that people use to do their family histories. So initially, if you wanted to do your family tree, you would use the records of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And they have an index, they still have it, called the ICI, which indexes all the births, marriages and deaths in the world, based on as many records as they can get hold of. And previously you had to consult that index on paper, there was lots of cross-referencing. They transferred it onto what's called microfilm. If you don't know what microfilm is, Just Google it and you'll see very old-fashioned machines that you'll still see in local libraries and record offices because people still use them. But it's a very laborious process, a very expensive process, because you've got to go to the archives to find these records. And so, although it's still popular, it was quite a minority pursuit to have the time to go to your local library and look all this stuff up. More recently, the digitisation of these records has made them globally available. So the two main companies that do this are Ancestry and Find My Past, and they've digitised the ICI index and all different types of records and made them searchable from home. So some of this workshop will be discussing what are the advantages of this process, this transformation of these records and their accessibility, and what are their disadvantages. What might be the problems in the fact that it's private companies who are now making these records accessible. And finally, we have community co-production of histories. This word co-production comes up a lot in funding applications. It's again trying to get away from this old academic and professional, in inverted commas, leadership of community projects, and trying to say that communities themselves produce archives, they produce their own oral histories, they produce their own histories, and so it shouldn't be an elite-led process. Communities can co-produce their histories with other people. And so the production of their own websites, so most community history groups will have their own websites telling their own histories, and we'll have a look at some of those. And you'll be making your own community history website. And often specific types of communities also produce their own material so they can share them globally. They might have been isolated as a community before, but now the internet has allowed them to share their stories globally. And I've just picked up an example from Australia, the Deaf in New South Wales project, and the timeline's particularly good. So you might think, well, why have they done that? Well, they want to preserve their own heritage and history, but also share it with other deaf communities elsewhere in the world. So this module will explore some of these ideas and equip you with the skills to look at all the different types of sources that you'll need to write your own community history and produce it on a website like that one.